So thank you everyone for joining us for Power of Grassroots Organizing with Jordan and Grace from Climate Justice Guelph. We'll be getting started, but just first an administrative note on how to use the chat. You can engage throughout the session. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see the chat area, and there are two options. There's events or sessions, and to share your thoughts while you're in the session and or to ask our speakers about questions, you can select the session tab and use the chat function there. Then if you want to view a window or the video larger, you can double click to maximize the view on your screen. And thank you again for being here at Watershed 2021. And thank you, Jordan and Grace, for letting us learn with you today. Without further ado, I'll pass it on over to you.
Hi, everyone. We can do a little bit of an introduction. I'm Jordan. I am a second-year environmental chemistry student at the University of Guelph, and I'm also in Climate Justice Guelph and Wellington Water Watchers.
And hi, everyone. I'm a fifth-year environmental sciences student at the University of Guelph as well. I'm the networking coordinator at Climate Justice Guelph. You'll find out a little bit more about what that means, but we would love to hear from you in the chat. You know, like who are you? Of course, if you feel comfortable, and feel free to comment and chat with us throughout the presentation. We kind of want this to feel a little bit like a discussion more than like, you know, we're talking at you.
I think we already have some people in there. Awesome. And I'm just going to start the presentation now. So welcome to the workshop focusing on grassroots organizing and ensuring longevity. So here's what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to do a little introduction of who we are, what Climate Justice Guelph is, and then we're going to go into some definitions about what we define as blanket campaigns, and then what we define as grassroots work, and then the connection to international movements. And then we're going to discuss where the disconnect is between all of this to have really strong action-heavy movements. And then we're going to go into how grassroots can help us with longevity and capacity and activism. And finally, leaving us with a discussion on what we can do to get involved.
So this is a little bit more about Climate Justice Guelph. Who are we? This is our theory of change. This is a little bit something new, but it acts as our mission statement, which is something you might be a little bit more familiar with from groups in your community. Basically, our strategy is to build a connection, a solidarity network between the groups in Guelph. All of the groups that are connecting to climate justice, which is not just climate action. We define this as groups that go beyond this. So workers' rights, health activism, social justice, food justice, all of these have a very important, and we want to connect these groups so that, you know, in the future, we are connected and we are mobilized together. So we want to build this full spectrum connected movement so that we can build resilience and grow our support together, and build community solidarity so that we are working together and we are having a broad spectrum take to activism. And this is because these diversified intersectional movements build the people power, the solidarity that is necessary to achieve our justice. We are a solidarity prioritized action. So whenever we are working or we are having our own event, we want to be doing this with other groups. We want to use to connect the community, because in Guelph specifically, there are so many different groups that have similar values and just different diverse backgrounds, and we should be working together. We need to like consider these other different backgrounds and how we can connect to them. So what do we think of when we look at activism? A lot of them see, you know, social media activism, infographics. You know, we have our own in the corner here. What do we mean by climate justice? That is something to clarify, you know, what we were doing, and that's on Instagram. A lot of people, you know, post things like climate justice now. These are things that people not involved in activism might think of when they think of activism, because it's seen, it's everywhere. Greta Thunberg, her speeches are amazing. And these big speeches that a lot of different people make are everywhere, and we really hold on to that. The big climate strike in 2019. That was huge. Huge global petitions like change.org. These are things that that might be their first step in activism. And it's a huge thing that's visible. So for the purpose of this workshop, that's the word for it, we are going to refer to these as blanket campaigns. These are these awareness campaigns, these symbolic actions that maybe governments take. It's not necessarily connected to direct action or direct policy, but these are important speeches or things that we might see very often in the news, these global international movements. And it makes it feel like there's this big change happening. But this is just one piece of the puzzle. And as we have a disclaimer at the bottom of this slide, this has immense value, but it is only one piece of the puzzle. It's only one crumble of the cookie. That is our little term of blanket campaigns. But there's something that we might miss in the meantime.
For sure. And going on to the next thing is the symbolic activism, these blanket campaigns. We're classifying them as a drug almost, where we're desensitized to regional news. And we have examples here in the photos of clean water in terms of 6 nations, or the Guelph City Council voting to not declare a climate emergency. And again, these are very important decisions who affect people's lives day to day. But we're desensitized to this regional news with how much content we intake on social media. This is especially city council meetings that have a connection to climate issues. But again, this workshop isn't only applicable to climate, it's applicable to various other issues. But again, on top of this, when we're desensitized and we're used to this bad news, or we're used to this disconnection between us and our municipal governments, we see these symbolic speeches, these protests and big conferences, and they act like a drug, making us feel that change is coming. Because again, our emotional connection to those is stronger than our connection to our local governments. And it skews our view of what activism needs to achieve. It can almost make us feel inferior to these individuals because again, we see Greta Thunberg, or we see really, really massive protests that people have organized in the streets screaming. And again, those have values, but they make us feel that that is what a successful activist is. That's what successful activism is, that you need to be invited to these big conferences to make these big speeches. And again, when people reflect on their own capacity and their own ability, they feel almost inferior to that, and that they can't get involved because they're not going to be successful because they can't be like them. And at the same time, we feel comforted at the idea of these speeches, large protests, etc. Even though we feel we can't be a part of it, we feel that someone else is doing it. And we make this almost weird connection that if someone else on TV is screaming about this issue and saying that this issue needs to be fixed, even if they're not from this local region, we feel something is going to change because we grasp onto them emotionally. And we forget about the grassroots work that those individuals probably did before, and the grassroots work that is needed to be able to even have these big, large conferences and movements in the first place. And here's where we go to what also activism can look like. And from here, it may be city council meetings online during a pandemic. It might also be at Speed River within Guelph, doing an awareness campaign and also a garbage cleanup, and connecting the two, doing direct action, and also discussing the importance of river health. On top of that, we just have further examples that are not associated with us, but in terms of city council meetings and delegations at local municipality governments, art galleries that are focusing on local water issues, Indigenous rights issues. And we have here in the top left-hand corner is one of the biggest attendance for this specific city's city council meeting in terms of climate justice. And again, this is another form that's often not fully talked about on the news. And if it's talked about on the news, it's in local news and not as big. And often we don't hold on to those as much as when we see these speeches. And that brings us to what we define as grassroots movements. So here we have what Climate Justice Guelph has organized. And again, this is not absolute, this is not complete, but a list of climate and environment and justice related groups within Guelph that are coming together for this coalition. And again, this coalition is to be able to provide resources for all of these different groups to be able to converse with one another, to be able to see how their different niches and their different backgrounds can come together, having a bunch of different skills that best contributes to a set of shared goals and visions. So again, we may have labor involved in this, we may have wetland groups involved in this, we may have policy groups. All of these different groups have different experiences, knowledge, etc. And that's needed because the climate issue, as we know, goes into water, it goes into waste, it goes into so many different justice issues that is endless, that you need that strong set of different backgrounds and different knowledge to tackle it. And that's why we say grassroots work incorporates specific knowledge of the area, often resulting in more richer action for that region. And that's not to say that international campaigns can't do this, but often when you have a stronger, more focused group within a certain region, you're going to have more knowledge that's able to be used and more suitable decisions to be made for that area. And often this has connections to local municipality governments that's more richer than an international campaign. And this comes into where's the disconnect? We like to say the grassroots is often slept on, where we have strong emotional connection to these big speeches and events that make us feel comforted. And we almost just throw it into this big soup of if we see someone speaking on TV, that's somehow going to come back to our community. That's somehow that speech and that action internationally is going to come back to us because we're so connected to social media and people talking about it. And you develop this connection to people who agree with you on social media. But again, where you're living and where you are, often you kind of disconnect from that. And that's what we're seeing. We like to say the grassroots plays the behind the curtain role in activism, where you don't see all the different types of skill sets that are used to be able to have those big conferences, to be able to have a movement like Black Lives Matter or like the climate movement that started out as grassroots movement and where people were doing localized actions and people didn't get news attention and all of these different things. Often blanket campaigns can kind of traverse into performative activism sometimes. And again, where people are feeling that they need to get the media attention, they need to get this to be able to make change. And that's because we're skewed of what we believe as successful activism. And as I said, our emotional connection to blanket campaigns distorts our idea of what work goes into making sustaining change on an issue. We're conditioned to believe that we need these large crowds in the street screaming, or we need celebrities to show up at an event for it to be considered important. And this was an example here of a BLM protest that got such high media coverage because Harry Styles was there. No hate to Harry Styles. Music is great. Just simply saying that, again, when people see this, they'll think of that campaign as successful because Harry Styles was there, not successful because of all of the other things it was able to do. And again, from that disconnect, then we lead into capacity, and I'll give it back to Grace.
Amazing. Thank you. When we think about this, like, we're thinking about how do we uplift these grassroots movements that are often slept on? How do we make all of our activism strong and resilient? One thing that's really important is capacity and taking care of the mental health of the people in our community, just taking care of people in general, especially with the way that our world is now and the climate crisis that has developed alongside colonialism, these big systemic issues. Among these other crises, like, these are not going to be fixed overnight. When we're tackling these systemic issues, we need to be dismantling these at the most basic level. So in our groups, in our any work we do, we try to make things a little bit different and a little bit more focused on capacity. Especially with climate anxiety, it is a huge thing. A lot of young people and people in general, activists looking to get involved, feel that they need to be the Greta Thunbergs of the world. They have to be, these invited to conferences to give big speeches and all of these things. And we don't need to necessarily be the big leaders or the big speech makers. It feels like, especially when you're someone starting out in activism, it feels like the world is on your shoulders and you feel like maybe you're not good enough. You're not there yet. So maybe the activism isn't worth it, but it is. It's all a part of it and it's all important. And we need to, like, get away from that mindset of media and news and celebrity is the most important thing, because it's not something that we really focus on as Climate Justice Guelph is capacity, just within the internal team. We do frequent capacity checks, frequent, wellness meetings, but also just with our work, we want to build capacity by connecting all these groups so that, when activists feel like, they maybe have to take a step back, they don't feel like the world is on their shoulders. They know that someone's there to pick up where they left off. This ensures that we have longevity in our activism. We have connections. We can continue this action into the future. We build a resilient movement. And this goes into kind of the different aspects of activism. So how are we dividing our labor? What are the different roles in activism, which I believe is on the next slide. If you could help me out. Thank you. These are some little graphics from the Slow Factory on Instagram. If you want to check them out, they have lots of great things like these, but these are really great ideas that kind of connect. They show that this blanket campaign activism is just one piece of the puzzle. Our big leaders, our speech makers, they are one role within this, our work, but we also need healers, we need frontline responders, we need researchers, we need caregivers, we need all of these different aspects. And at the center, as you can see, is all of these things we're working towards: equity, inclusion, liberation, interdependency, justice, solidarity. Those are all things that we're working towards. Yes, and then on the right side, we also have kind of a really helpful idea. This was mentioned, the first time I heard it was on the How to Save a World podcast. This is another way that we ensure longevity in our work. As individuals, bring us joy. What are we good at? But then also, what's the work that needs doing? And if we are working at the intersection of those three things, it's going to be a more sustainable way for you to be involved, because you need to honor what you love, but you also need to honor what you're good at, and we want to do the work that needs to be done. So I would encourage everyone to take a couple minutes, think about maybe the work that you do, and think about maybe where you fit, and feel free to share. No pressure, but this is something to really think about. Where do you fit within our roles? And also, this picture on the left is not by any means the full spectrum. There can be other roles in our work. It's just an example. So, where do you fit? Or, we can give an example of Climate Justice Guelph. We kind of work at the intersection of kind of connecting these people. So that's almost a new role in itself. Yeah. So we're going to take a few minutes and think about that.
I'm just going to jump in because Tim asked a really, really good question. Just while everyone's typing and stuff, I'll just go through it. So Tim asked, local politicians say the right thing, but then their actions show they do not believe what they say. And how are we going to ensure that we're not used for our labor, essentially? And that's a really, really good point. And one thing I've learned, especially since I'm pretty new to Guelph, and there's a lot of activism here that's helped me realize this, is continuing to occupy space. And what I mean by that is, again, we'll get into it when it's how do we get involved in the next slide. But when it comes to city council meetings, which is often the same amount of people surrounded by each other, typically just the people that are in council, surrounded by each other, talking to each other with the same ideas, same mindset, same agenda. And again, we see, like you said, people say the right thing, especially during election time. But then again, that follow-up is not there. So again, ensuring, there's two things I wanted to add on to that point, was that continually going to these fiscal budget meetings, continually going to these city council meetings, whether you have a network of people that are able to go when you can't go, etc., and ask the same questions and ensure you're getting the same answer. And again, that's only one part, because again, that's just people saying things. But then from there is being able to mobilize that knowledge, to people within the community, because again, often they don't expect, and people don't, like politicians don't expect what they talk about in their city council meeting to be broadly spread across the local region that they're talking about. And from there, that puts a lot more accountability on them, because again, in more common terms, they will get called out for being a liar, and they will get called out for not acting how they're supposed to act. And that's again where Grassroots comes in, is often being able to mobilize those public city council meetings, those specific meetings that you hold with politicians on your own, like we've done in Climate Justice Guelph. And again, basically, there's so much talk, so much banter at election time, and often that accountability is not held throughout because people don't have the capacity to be able to constantly almost babysit these politicians. So again, having that strong grassroots network with people of different backgrounds who have knowledge on these different decisions that politicians are making, on top of being able to share that broadly, it's going to add on to holding them much more accountable. And if they're going against what their constituents follow, if they're going against what they say they're going to do, you've basically almost set up an entire campaign throughout their entire time in being office of how they've constantly let down people. And people aren't going to just hear about that at election time when people sound like, when politicians are screaming at one another. Through the entire time of their campaign, people are constantly being reminded, they said they were going to do this, they're not going to do this, and it's mobilized to the entire community. And politicians are trying to get re-voted in. And if they now see that there's a structure that's constantly they're constantly holding them accountable, then we're eventually going to see the change that we want. Sorry if that was a very long answer to your question.
I love that, honestly. And I would add that, like, when you think about it, like us as individual people, we notice specific things, but there are things that I don't understand that I won't pick up on. But if we're connected to groups that are picking up on those other things, we're picking up on every lie. Like, it's basically just reiterating what Jordan said. But yeah, I can talk about a little bit, like, where does Climate Justice Guelph come in to why? Yes, Shifra, that is a great podcast, How to Save a Planet. They really talk about this picture on the right, which is something that's has been really important for me to think about when I first heard about it. But it's something that is at the core of Climate Justice Guelph. Like, we have separate working groups, so we make sure that the people that are involved in whatever work that they're doing, we want to make sure that they're doing what they feel comfortable, what they feel good at, and what needs to be done within our group. So, I mean, I love people. I love, like, plants and farming. I love media and creative communication, movies, all of those things. And I have skills in scientific research, writing, making graphics, all through, classic university education. But, like, there's so many examples of skills that you could have that are important to this work. And there's plenty of things that need to be done. Like, right now, our group is working on an event for fossil fuel divestment on the Day of Action, October 29th. So I am using my skills to help build and organize that event. There's just things like that. But yeah, we can talk a little bit about how we can get involved.
Yeah, and I was just going to quickly add on top of what you were saying is, again, when you use like that diagram on the right and like you think about all those things and find the intersectionality, not only are you going to be sustainable, happy, and like feel like you're doing something, the quality of your work is going to be much.
Exactly.
You can think about that in any part of your life, that again, when you are more focused and like the division of labor and focused on something without the constant worry that what you're doing is useless because of blanket campaigns and us being conditioned that this is not what activism is supposed to look like. When you get past that and you're actually focusing, like, again, just like Grace, like I enjoy the intersectionality between science and policy, and I like helping with like literature reviews and all of that kind of stuff. And then on top of that, event planning, then those again, lost our train of thought. Those again are where I feel best fit. And when I'm working on those and I'm focused, I'm not worrying about if what I'm doing is enough, because I know that this needs to be done and the best work possible that I can put into it needs to be done. And that's what's going to be needed. And I think we need to change our mindset away from constantly feel like we have to just be this like activist machine that's doing a bunch of different jobs and making this huge campaign. We're going to burn ourselves out and end up making the issue worse because it doesn't have the longevity.
And this is something that like is the status quo, is just not wanting you to do what you love and connect all of these three. It's not necessarily the focus of the status quo. The status quo kind of is very of our system that has led us here, kind of just wants you to focus on what's needed, and bam, like it's not necessarily connected to that. And I think that we can improve our quality of work, as Jordan said. But yeah, so not sure, but if any of you are interested in getting involved, or you're not already involved, or you know people who aren't involved, researching climate and activism groups in your region. As we mentioned, work that's exactly what Climate Justice Guelph does, or that is climate action, like that is not the only thing that is needed for climate justice. There are, food justice groups, there are, just taking care of your community. All of these different things are so important to be building a resilient effort. So if there isn't one in your community, think about, do I have the capacity to make one? But if there's already groups like this in your community, reinventing the wheel is not necessarily necessary. So they're out there, they have the resources, and your unique skills can help them greatly.
And honestly, that idea of reinventing the wheel is, again, I often feel people get in the idea that they need to create a new group to be an activist to get something done in their region.
That's so true.
Yeah. And like, that's almost, again, the idea of like us being conditioned to believe that that's what successful activism is. But again, if the networking history, the resources, et cetera, are already there with different groups, you can be the most useful and the most helpful in joining and using your skills that you reflect on with those groups, versus creating a group and being completely disconnected from them and working in the same region but not talking to them. That, again, is often not as productive. And the last thing is attending city council and fiscal budget meetings. So again, this may sound boring, we talked about it before, but these meetings are where very important policy decisions are made, which is often just being the same people talking to each other. But again, having that network of different people from different backgrounds going to these meetings, catching things that, like Grace said, catching different things, and then being able to mobilize that knowledge to the rest of the community, you're going to have more people aware throughout the entire term that they are in term, whether they're doing what they're supposed to do or not. And people have a literal legacy of their term, versus being screened a bunch of information right at election time before they have to go vote, and they just vote for who they've been voting for the entire time. And this doesn't have to be just on the local level. This happens on provincial and federal levels as well. And I do see another question in the chat. So when was the first time you realized that grassroots organizing is the way to go, or how did you feel inspired to work through grassroots organizing? Yeah, so honestly, I'm going to be really honest. Very recently, it is not something that I've grew up my entire life knowing that grassroots is the way to go. Also only 19, so that would be kind of weird. But it's more of, honestly, when I came to Guelph, I did a lot of climate, environment, and race-based activism in high school. But I come from a small town where there wasn't really any of that activism. So I was constantly having to create a group. There wasn't Black History Month at my school. There wasn't climate or environment groups at my school. There wasn't environment groups in Bowmanville. Oh, just outed where I used to live, but that's okay. And all of these types of things. There wasn't those types of things. So again, I was focused on that. But when I got to Guelph and got to this region where there's so many different types of groups, there's so many groups talking to each other, and there's a good set amount of people that care, I realized that this is why groups in this region get a lot of things done. They get a lot of change. And honestly, yeah, that's really where I started to notice. And I just constantly thinking of during quarantine, I'm sure everyone's mental health was a little rough, but during quarantine, just still wanting to do activism, because just because there's a pandemic doesn't mean there's a climate crisis, or just because there's a pandemic doesn't mean that Black and brown people aren't targeted by the police. All of these different things, I still wanted to be involved in, but I had to be online. But then I realized the kind of just like the deep hole that you fall into of just infographics without next step slides, or like the fact that like links and resources were always at the end of infographics where people never actually always swipe through. And then the idea of activism was not to get people connected, talking and making change and talking about solutions to problems. The point of activism was to make people aware and mad at something. And that's where I kind of noticed that insta activism and just different types of social media activism is not as productive when we hold it to such a high standard.
Totally.
So yeah, that's kind of where I started.
Yeah, honestly, like very similar for me, especially for the Instagram things. Like it kind of just leaves you with this like angry feeling and nowhere to put it. And it's just kind of felt like, you know, everyone is almost virtue signaling to each other through Instagram and Twitter and social media. And this might be a completely different world to you guys, but for young activists, this is very real. There's a lot of virtue signaling, and it feels like it's like, what are we doing? And then, you know, I started in high school getting involved in my environmental club. It was just called Environment Club, I think. And the teacher that ran it cared so much about the little things. He cared so much about grassroots, and he taught me so much about it. I could literally cry thinking about him. I love him. And he literally started me thinking about these things. And it all came from a place of just caring about these things, which that's why we care about, you know, these big symbolic speeches and these huge marches in the streets. People care. So we just want to figure out how we can direct that caring to action. And that's kind of you go to meetings and you go where there are activists working together, and you learn the value of grassroots. That's really what happened to me, was just getting involved with like Climate Justice Guelph, and just going to marches. More and more, the more activists you meet, the more you learn about the things that they do that are so important. But yeah, this moves perfectly into our next slide. Is just, yeah, like I said, how do we go from caring to action? How do we make these grassroots kind of other roles of activism, like caregiving and first responders and all of those things, how do we make those things more visible, and how do we get people to care a little bit more about them? Or how do we get people more involved in them? How do we yes and to blanket campaigns? How do we be like, yes, blanket campaigns, but also let's also get involved in grassroots? And that's kind of what we've been trying to do here. Yeah. Any more thoughts, Jordan?
I was just going to say, like, I know we don't have too much time. So with the time that we have left, if people have any brainstorming ideas, I can name a few that I've been trying to think of, but it's really is almost one thing that you can easily start with is changing the way that you share things on social media. Kind of reflect on how many local things are you sharing, how many local decisions, how many local pieces of, I'm just speaking to environment since we're at a Watershed conference, but it can be anything. But how much of that is local compared to international? Not that you can't share those different broader campaigns and speeches, but just
those are still important. Totally.
Yeah. And again, just that yes, and how can you start to make the people that follow you, make the people that you're friends with on Facebook or Instagram or whatever, start to almost like constantly see every time they click on your page a local thing. And again, that's going to take time, but it does have that ripple effect of the people that you're connected to are going to start to be more aware of it and start to see that you care more about it. And again, that kind of transfers. On top of that, as you already said, going to those grassroots meetings and using your skills to be able to mobilize that knowledge to the rest of your community. So like make what happens at those meetings a big deal. Like they are a big deal, but people don't feel that way. Maybe start to write your own posts on social media about what's happening at those meetings, what's happening with the decisions, what's the local news happening in terms of climate activism. Oh, that was an email I got, just ignore that. And like the last thing I would say is just on top of that, whether you feel that maybe your skills don't fit into activism, which I would say is almost impossible. Whatever your specific interests are, there is room for you within the climate movement. But also, when you're like saying like, oh, you tell your friends or whoever you're like, oh, I'm involved in this really cool group, we do X, Y, and Z. On top of that, tell them we need X, Y, and Z. We need someone doing this role. Or I've heard about this other group, this local group that needs this done. And like, if you think that your friend's skills fit that, tell them if they care about it. And that's like, honestly, like, is like really just like changing the mindset of people within your lives, that whatever they're doing within their lives, whatever their life situation is, they can be a part of the solution. Because
Totally.
if they care, they can be a part of the solution. It's just they need to get out of the, I almost like to say it's like capitalism within activism, and that we see almost, again, in capitalism, we see billionaires and trillionaires, and we think that that's what the idea of success is. Well, within activism, we see these huge conferences and these often campaigns with no networking ability as the success of activism. So trying to dismantle that and make people feel that they're contributing to a solution no matter what skills they have, because everything is needed when an issue is so broad and so over a large spectrum.
Totally. And that's just, that's just one thing. Like, even if there's no roles there for you, like there can be, like, we can build new roles. Those are totally new, like, there's room for things that there are room for skills that we don't even have roles for, because the person with the skills isn't there. Like, there's always room to invent new things and create a more amplified movement. Another thing that, like, how do we make grassroots visible is just amplifying the work, telling your friends and family, as Jordan said. It looks like we have a comment here. Totally. About social media, we've talked a lot about social media aspect, because that's just one way. But yes, that is just one way to share your ideas. How much beyond that, like, social media is just one aspect. However, it's something that we are very principled in as young people that have just been birthed with social media in their hands.
But what Sheila said is like really, really, really important, especially since like accessibility, certain people don't find social media accessible. So again, just finding ways to get people of different backgrounds, different ages, etc., involved, is because they're all involved in the community and they all have a right to be involved in the movement. And I think I'll finish off by saying that.
All right, thank you so much, Jordan and Grace. That was really insightful. Yeah, just some really good points, honestly. I think I got a lot from this workshop, actually. Okay, so I just want to direct you all to the next session. It will be starting soon. It's a concert. And yeah, just so much thanks for our speakers.
Everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.